And yeah, thanks again for everyone who's joined for this week's Digit Debates, which is we're going to have the two speakers, Zahira Jaser and Dimitra Petrakaki, and they're going to tell us a little bit about their research, which is looking at young job seekers' experiences of using asynchronous video interviews. So sort of automated job interviews, so a very sort of topical subject. But before I introduce Zahira and Dimitra, I'd just like to say thank you, take this opportunity to thank the ESRC who fund the Digit Research Centre and make all these debates and this debate series possible. So just to introduce our speakers, Zahira is Assistant Professor at the University of Sussex Business School, and she's the Deputy Director of the MBA course here. Her work focuses on how managers negotiate relationships across the organization and how AI mediates relationships between managers and employees. So her research is featured in a number of sort of public-facing outlets such as the Financial Times, The Guardian, the BBC World Service, for example, among other things. So it's really great to have her here to tell us a bit about the research, and also Dimitra. And Dimitra is a Professor of Technology and Organisation here at the University of Sussex Business School, and she's Deputy Head of the Department for Management here. She's also co-investigator of the Digit Research Centre, and her work focuses on the implications of new technology for the organisation of work. She's also assistant editor of Information Systems Journal and is on the editorial board for New Work, Technology and Employment. So just before I hand over to them, I'd also like to mention a couple of other things. So firstly, there's a blog available on this research that Zahira and Dimitra have done, which is on the Digit Research Centre website. And also, I'd just like to briefly mention the Digit Debates talk for next week, where we're going to welcome Sana Ojumpera, who's going to talk about skills for the planetary labour market, focusing on Indian workers in the platform economy. So without further ado, I'll just hand over to Zahira and Dimitra.
Okay. Well, let me start by saying thank you very much for the Digit Centre to offering this opportunity to speak about our research. Thank you so much, Will, for such a gracious introduction, and Gemma for organizing things impeccably. We now need to follow suit in the high standards, so hopefully we're going to do well. But, you know, this research came about, you know, let me just speak a little bit about the agenda. So we are going to tell you about how we came to do this research, because this is not my normal field of research. I usually study managers and leadership. Of course, I am kind of a social psychologist, microsociologist. And also, you know, whilst, you know, Dimitra studies technology and organization, she does not look at this kind of individual level recruitment, HR type of thing. So this is a new field for us. So how did we came across this? We're going to speak about this. We're going to speak about our research approach, a little bit about the literature, and then we're going to connect it to theory on the sociology of technology. We're going to show you some early conclusions and then the recommendations that we put through out of this research. And also we are seeking, you know, critical thinking about how we follow, because this is initial research. So if during the research you think you have any ideas about how we could improve and do things better, or things that we have overlooked, we'd love to hear about this at the end. Okay, so this all started because I mentor students from less privileged socioeconomic backgrounds. One of the students wants to work into finance. Finance was my previous career before being an academic. So we speak at length for almost a year on how we can or she can improve. They can improve and, you know, be presentable and really fine tune themselves to get to work into these large finance institutions. So time of hiring comes, the end of year comes, they start applying. And so I asked them, how are you doing? You know, how are you received? And they said, I don't know, because I'm just interviewed by bots. I'm like, what? Can you explain that again? So yes, so it comes out that the majority of young job seekers who are looking for placement or looking for their first job are now facing a bot. And so from this empathy for this person that was in a really difficult situation, or put this picture here to show you how some students from a socioeconomic background are really carrying their family to, fill that intergenerational gap of poverty often. And so they go into this with great expectation, and then they're faced by a bot. So we really want to explore the human experience of these interviews. Automated video interviews or asynchronous video interviews have been a growing phenomenon. This is some research that we've done. The majority of employers, large companies now really use this, because during COVID, we have seen mass applications through virtual work through HR. So HR managers find themselves inundated with applications, and really what they're doing, they're automating the process of selection, and the process of selection is also automated through these video interviews. So there is a lot of data about this out there, and there is more data coming out about how this is an increasing phenomenon. At the same time, the university was proposing through the HAFE UK RISE scheme to do some quick research to try to put out some knowledge about this, COVID recovery and how COVID had changed the world of work. So for us, coming from this understanding of this dilemma that these young job seekers face, it was actually quite quick to put out a request for a grant that was really connecting to a real problem and could really help a circumscribed community of people, which were young job seekers. So we did this research initially to generate knowledge exchange outputs. And that's exactly what we did. So we got £25,000 research, and in 4 months, we generated 4 outputs. An employer toolkit, so we paired up with the Institute of Employment Studies to generate an employer toolkit that was disseminated to their base of employers. 2 videos to explain to young job seekers how this phenomenon worked. We're going to show you one of the videos today, and then we put out a policy brief. So let's step out a little bit. We also produced an Harvard Business Review article. And the most important thing for us that we need to develop now, we're really keen to do this as well as possible, is to produce an academic paper which we are presenting at EGOS this year. So let's speak a little bit about the theoretical assumptions behind our research.
So in this study, we take a socio-technical approach to look into technology. And this means that we take the social, which in this case is the human experience, to be co-constitutive of the technology that facilitates and enables the experience of job seekers as they encounter these automated job interviews. Technology is here broadly defined to include any form of technologies that underpin interviews, including artificial intelligence, videos, bots, and many others. In taking this socio-technical approach, we assume that agency is not only a human property, but technology has some agency too. Various scholars, particularly those who come from sociology of technology and actor network theory, have attributed to technology certain anthropomorphic, which means human characteristics, to the agency of technology by looking into what technology does as we interact with it. And one of the quotes from Bruno Latour essentially talks about anything that can modify a state of affairs by making a difference is in a way an actor that has an agency. Next slide. Indeed, we understand the agency of the technology by looking into the ways in which it enables and constrains our actions as we interact with it. And the literature has identified some particular examples or manifestations of technological agency. These tend to underpin many or indeed all forms of technology, constituting in a way its essence. So we have presenting here four main processes: simplification, closure, entrustment, and representation, as being some of the most interesting examples of technological agency. So technology simplifies by reducing complexity into more manageable, concrete, and measurable parts. For example, if you look into health applications that exist in your smartphone or your smart watch, you will see that the concept of health is reduced into measurable indicators, such as, for example, the steps that you take, the calories you consume, your sugar intake, and so on. Technology also brings closure by prescribing what is desirable in terms of behavior and practices and what is not desirable, and framing behavior in particular ways. Another manifestation of technological agency is what you find in the literature as entrustment, which essentially means the trust we place to technology to automate by executing tasks in a large scale. And finally, technology represents by making things visible and bringing them closer. It doesn't, however, have the capacity to make these things known for what they are. It only therefore gives us a very partial knowledge. Take, for example, social media platforms that have the capacity to extract specific data about individuals' activity, therefore giving us a partial knowledge about who these people are, what is their personality, etc., but we don't really know them for what they are. Next slide.
So let's see, so we told you where we come from, we told you what our theoretical assumptions are, and so how are we moving then to investigate? How are we moving to explore our research questions? So we are adopting a phenomenological perspective to research. This is rooted in phenomenological philosophy. Particularly, we are looking at Heidegger, which also is at the basis of the sociology of technology that Dimitra just spoke about. So we really have a consistent approach to really try to understand and unpack the subjective experience of the individuals that we are studying, in this case, young job seekers. Phenomenological approaches really look at phenomenon from the person's perspective. This is very interesting for us, and we will look at this a little bit more when we go into the literature, but the majority of studies on this kind of technologies is done from the perspective of the improvement of the technology itself, rather than from the perspective of understanding the experience of the person that uses the technology. When we look, there is a UX literature, which is user experience literature, but yet the user experience is harvested to improve the technology. Here, we do not care about improving the technology. We really are trying to understand what's the impact on these people of this technology. And we are basing ourselves on the phenomenology, interpretative phenomenological analysis of John Smith. And we were particularly lucky to have with us as research assistant one of the PhD students of John Smith at Birkbeck University that joined us last July to do a lot of these interviews. So we were really lucky in building up a research team which was very much aligned around this idea. So what did we do to carry out the research? So the first thing that we do, of course, we went into the literature, and we found there is a very scant literature about automated video interviews. Of course, the papers are increasing by the minute, because this is a very topical subject. But we identified 20+ articles. They mostly focused on the effectiveness of the technology in the recruitment process, as we said, and they were more technology focused than human experience focused. So from the outset, we had identified that we were actually onto something that no one else had looked at from our angle. We then realized that the experience of these young job seekers was very much based on what the technology, how the technology was built, rather than on the employment relationship or who the employer was. And this is a massive difference in how candidates have experienced in interviews before. So we really went into looking at who were the makers of this technology, and these makers we call platforms. And we did archival material. We researched the platforms, how they present themselves to young job seekers, how they present themselves to employers. Then we finally did only 20 in-depth interviews. So this is a research which still needs to develop. Largely, the interviewees were students from Great Britain, from a mixed background. And it was particularly how, in order to capture their experience, we divided our interview in 3 parts. One was pre the interview. So what was their experience when they received the announcement that they were going to go for this kind of automated interview? What was their experience during, and what was their experience after? Now, you can understand that from a phenomenological perspective, what you really want to understand is to understand the unfiltered experience of someone when they're doing something. But of course, our challenge here was precisely that. How do we understand the experience of someone that is doing something as a job interview? We cannot be there. We cannot ask him to be there. It's ethically, improper to be there at such important time of people's life where they need to stay concentrated on something else. And so, we really are looking for ways of continuing our research through ways of understanding people's experience in a way that is unfiltered. And we can speak about this a little bit at the end. So the literature, I just mentioned very quickly that the literature is scant, is developing at the moment. We are locating our research more broadly in the wider research on the automatization of human resource processes. So we are looking at literature on algorithmic management and electronic performance measurements. So we are really going into this kind of this is the big umbrella literature within which we are writing. We are also particularly going into literature that can work on the side of HR managers. So a few weeks ago, Andrew Chalroot came and presented his great paper in HMJ about the automatization of HR processes and the amount of questions and ethical questions, regulatory questions that come up with that. So we are really going, contributing hopefully to this literature. We then went into the literature about asynchronous video interviews or automated video interviews. Langer is one of the biggest writers in this kind of interview, in this literature. But these people start from a really more psychological perspective, understanding how to optimize the process of interview in order to create better candidates, on how information is provided to candidates in a way that makes the interviews more or less, the technology more or less accepted. Of course, this literature is, scientific, therefore it has a critical aspect. So there is some literature that tells us that these technologies are not at all perfect and precise. So some papers like the Hickman et al. 2021 really doubts the validity and reliability of algorithms to interpret interviews and to produce a selection process that is both valid and reliable. There are also advantages. This is such a really not black and white, area of research. There is also advantages of these interviews because of the sheer amount of candidates that are applying to companies. So it's not necessarily bad to have technology helping us, especially sometimes it's not viable to do this selection in these large numbers in any other ways. So we're really left hanging in terms of, what can be the best way to go about this. And also the other thing that is extremely important, and we must not underestimate, is that this technology is in its infancy. And we will see in a second that this technology, it is proposed to us as really perfect and oversold by the platforms. But actually, when we look behind at the algorithm, we know algorithms are biased, and we know algorithms that recognize human behavior really embed bias. Here is just one example, but we could bring more. about how these algorithms are biased. And in this case, for example, the Haas Center for Equity, Gender and Leadership in Berkeley's realized that facial recognition algorithms have a 35% higher detection error in recognizing the gender of women of color compared to men with lighter skin. So, just something as easy as gender can really be misunderstood by these technologies. One last point that I want to make here is that during this, we had the privilege, both Dimitra and I, to really test some of these face recognition technologies. We were provided with some, safe ways of doing that. And we realized how simplistic they are. It was enough to put our mouth like this for the technology to read that we were in a positive state of mind or a positive emotional state. So, these technologies are not at all mature. So the problem is that now the employment relationship moves from being from employers to candidates to technology to candidates, right? So the way the candidates really experience employment in the first place is through technology. So our first point of contact has been really to look at platforms. Here we bring you some example of our archival experience. So for example, here we have the homepage of Hirevue.com. Hirevue.com is one of the largest providers of interviews or online job interviews. So these job interviews can be white labeled. So, for example, I think L'Oreal have their own technology, but of course, is the technology provided by someone else is white label. Or some people really just send you a Hirevue link. So you go, as a candidate, the first thing you do is you look up, and what you find is this page. And this page is telling you that this is a business. And this is a business which main role is to save money to employers. So, in one way or the other, you're already seeing yourself as a resource that need to be saved on straight away. So this is quite interesting. So then you go into the page, then all of these platforms have pages that are user-faced. So you go and look at the page of the users, and we can see how there is some boosting of interview skills. So there is some suggestion of what you can do, but there is also a selling of the technology as something absolutely positive, right? So this is also part of the experience that these job candidates went through. So the first thing that we did was looking in depth at how platforms present themselves. The second thing that we did, we realized when we started speaking to interviewees, but also looking at platforms, is that it is not straightforward what an automated video interview is. So we found straight away much more complexity. We kept on talking to each other in the research team thinking, I've seen that and I've seen that. And we really started to think like, this phenomenon that to us was as simple as speaking to a screen is now becoming much more complex. So what we did is, at the end, we put together a video for students to understand what the phenomenon is about. And we would like to share this video with you right now. So you have also a break from me continuing to speak to you. So I'll give you, give me a second. I'm gonna share the screen again. And I'm going to put on the video. Here we go. So just 2 minutes of a video.
87% of job interviews in the last year happened online. Many of these involve some form of artificial intelligence. Video interviews take different shapes and forms and can be confusing. Often, both the hiring employer and the tech platform on which the interviews happen do not tell us much about what is going on. Through our research at the University of Sussex Business School, we took a deep dive into the hiring process to find out more. We identified a spectrum of interview types, in which the in-person becomes impersonal, and we have called it the depersonalization spectrum. Pre-pandemic, face-to-face interviews had several benefits. They gave us both contextual and personal cues. First, when traveling to a place of work for the interview, we had the opportunity to transition into a different mindset. Also, during the interview, we would get cues from the interviewer, a kind of real-time feedback, helping us adjust the direction of our thoughts and words. Now, interviews can happen through a screen, Skype, Teams, or Zoom, keeping the cues of a human conversation but losing the contextual ones. But the real change is coming from the mass use of automated video interviews, which we call AVIs. AVIs record you alone in front of a screen. Unsurprisingly, you might feel uncertain or even anxious when doing this type of interview because of the loss of cues. But also, how will it be assessed? Here is where we found our research participants were mostly confused. AVIs might be assessed by a human who, watching the video, interprets your expressions and words, or by an algorithm, a form of artificial intelligence, which will produce a report by automatically interpreting your words, the tone of your voice, or even the expression of your face. The bot will definitely miss many of the cues that a human would use when watching the AVI. Nevertheless, the resulting report will be used to make a hiring decision, either by a human reading the report or by the algorithm itself. So be aware, if you're offered an online interview, ask the employer what kind of interview it is going to be so that you can prepare. And if you want to know more about AVI technology, watch our next video.
So let me reshare my screen. There we go. So in short, we found this very complex phenomenon where AVIs were taking several forms. We did put together also another video, which I'm not sharing with you, about the kind of data that AVIs, so there are not just different forms of AVIs, but there are also kind of different data that AVIs harvest from the human that they are interfacing. Verbal is the words people speak. So they have some neurolinguistic processor usually that decode these words. Vocal, so they actually decode people's emotions from the tone of voice, and also face recognition. Although there are some Hirevue was, for example, taken to court for using face recognition. So there is more and more regulatory stuff that comes in to regulate this, but at the moment there is not much. So 4 themes. So out of all this research, we came out with 4 themes. 4 themes that are here represented by this ideographic that were used in the employer toolkit. I'm now going to go through these 4 themes very quickly, and then we will go back to our put our academic hat on, and really connect these to theory, and Dimitra will help us do that. So these 4 themes are the glorification of technology. So let's focus for a second on this platform, quote at the bottom. You can remain confident that every new hire represents the best possible decision, regardless of age, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation. In turn, this leads to a more diverse and inclusive workplace and a more engaged, innovative, and successful business. This is what this platform is telling us they do. We know that they don't do that exactly because we have already looked at the research behind it. However, young job seekers are exposed to this narrative, both by the employers and the employees. So they, in their mind, they have the tendency to overestimate and objectify the efficiency of the effectiveness of the technology. Then at the same time, they go through the experience of feeling their humanity diminished. And we actually have seen in the depersonalization spectrum that the humanity actually does diminish, as in they're not facing any more humans, but also, and the second quote here from participant 2 is very representative of this, most of the candidates, without us asking, they told us that they felt like becoming robot-like. Robot-like. So there goes the next question, and you just have to keep going, kind of like you are a robot, which you kind of are. And even if they were not actually using the word robot, let's look at what participant once told us. I maintain deliberate eye contact. So first of all, in order to adapt to the AI, I made sure my hands were still. I made deliberate eye contact. I spoke with a rather monotone use of voice, and to allow the AI to pick on what I was saying, right? So toning down the emotion and making yourself more robot-like to be liked by the robot. Now, the interesting thing, and this is what theme 3 is illustrating, is that platforms realize that people make themselves robot-like, And so what platforms put out is suggestions on how to stay humans during these kind of interviews. And this is, we have one from platform 1. Be authentic and remember to relax, have fun, and let your skills and personality do the talking. Most importantly, be authentic. Don't worry about making eye contact with the camera and so on and so forth. So we have glorification of the AI, we have a dehumanization of the candidate, and with the rehumanization of the candidates, so an attempt to stay humans, according to the instruction provided by the technology. And then finally, and unsurprisingly, we have detected a theme in this interview consistently of emotional and cognitive fatigue. So the participants conformed more and more to the technology, and this brought them really to put a lot to make a lot of effort and emotional work and emotional labor. So it's quite hard to smile looking at a computer screen, trying to smile looking at webcam for 30, 40 minutes. You're putting all this effort. So we also, participant 10 at the bottom, she had tried so many of these interviews. And this was a really, really, really discouraging attempt from her. The other point that is worth making here is that because a lot of candidates glorify the AI, the emotional and cognitive fatigue was also coming from feeling that they were not adequate and they were not good enough to be selected by this, perfect technology. And so they were thinking that there was entirely their fault they were not selected, rather than some AI bias. So this was a really, really interesting process. So let's connect it to theory.
Yeah, so the findings we have presented here indicate that really the way candidates experience these automated job interviews is very much related to the way in which they have interacted with the different technologies. And what we also see is that the previous forms of technological agency that we presented, as they become manifest through the process of simplification, closure, automation, and representation, they all play out in different ways in these experiences. And these ways are very subtle and very messy. So up until now, we have just made an attempt to really unpack this messiness and understand what is happening. Next slide, please. So one of our findings that Zahira presented earlier suggests that job candidates respond to automated interviews by performing like robots. And actually, if you remember, one of the candidates says that they are actually robots in this process of automated interview. They thus present themselves in particular ways only, ways they think will please the underpinning algorithm, but not in ways they necessarily feel comfortable with. As they thus frame themselves in this way, they become known to the other side, to the hiring manager, in a limited and partial way only. This also, of course, raises a lot of questions about the effectiveness of automated interviews to provide the right information, the meaningful information to hiring managers, but it also suggests this simultaneous process of kind of closure and framing of their behavior and the way in which they get represented in a very limited and partial way. Our findings also suggest that job candidates feel that they become, Zahira is the previous one.
Oh, sorry.
Become resources that are being used in a continuous process of automated job interviewing. Many of our interviewees actually suggested that they have been through the same process of automated interview several times. At the same time, because they do not get any feedback, or maybe the feedback is very limited, there is no opportunity for them to learn about their performance and to develop further. And this strengthens very much the argument that they become resources that feed this process of automated interviews without receiving anything back, and it becomes really an example of simplification, how their character, how their personalities become reduced to very kind of a resource almost based view. Next slide. Findings also reflect asymmetrical relations of power between the technology and job candidates. Technology, as Zahira said earlier, extracts data from the job candidates. And that is because the hiring decision needs to be made. Candidates therefore become reduced to their data, and they are only known through them. They become, if we use Deborah Lapton's word, datafied subjects, and they are represented only on the basis of the information that the algorithm has extracted. We see therefore again a process of a simplification and a closure, a particular framing of job candidates. And paradoxically, despite all the negative experiences that job candidates have reported about automated interviews, interviewees glorified technology. They too got so much immersed into this discourse that platforms make about the objectivity of AIs and about how transparent the process become, that they actually thought that this is the kind of the right way, that automation of hiring process is actually a beneficial thing, and potentially in the future it can become like a faultless process. And we therefore see a confirmation of this idea of the entrustment of technology to undertake and automate the hiring process. So next slide, where we are going from here. So we are still in the process of analyzing our interviews and our documents, and we want to understand a bit more about how job candidates' experience can be understood and comprehended through this theoretical framework. So our next plan is to collect diaries where job candidates will reflect on their experience of automated job interviews. These diaries will offer them the kind of space to write up their reflections, but at the same time there will be a few prompts so that we can direct their thought to the questions that we also want to answer. And as we take our research forward, we hope to be able to contribute theoretically to the literature that looks into AI in the hiring process. And we aim to really illuminate the socio-technical processes that underpin this experience of automated job interviews, and particularly to look into how these processes of simplification, closure, and representation and entrustment play out in the way in which people experience automated job interviews. Next slide.
So thank you very much, Dimitra. So, that basically, concludes in a way the part of our presentation that, that wants really to connect to our academic development of the research. But so far, because of the knowledge exchange, we already put out a series of recommendations from our first data findings, and I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. So the first recommendation we put out are to students, and this is a video that can really illustrate that. So we are telling students, we are teaching them techniques on how they can do that. This video is present in our in the blog, but also in our research website. We also put through explanation to platforms and employers. We create this glass box paradigm. The glass box is a really interesting approach to explaining technology to users. And it's really very nicely articulated in a number of articles here. The Sokol et al. Is one of them at the bottom of this slide. And the glass approach tells us that there are certain criteria that we need to use when we explain technology. So adopting this criteria, we are suggesting that both platforms and employers really need to explain, especially platforms need to explain the technology in an understandable way. So candidate employers need to understand the AVIS function, and in the interview, how it works, how data is collected, and how data is used and by whom. It also needs to be interpretable. So the explanation needs to be provided in a clear and ambiguous terms and non-technical terms, fully representative of the process that underpins AVIs. And we find that this is actually not the case, as platforms often oversell, and they say that they do more than they actually do. The process needs to be transparent. So the role of AI within the automated video interviews needs to be specified, whether it is passive, assisted, or AI-led. So we would like people to really use the spectrum that we have created to aid the explanations of this. We have seen a lot of people coming back to our Harvard Business Review piece also, in which we explain the spectrum. So we hope that these explanations stick. And then we also think that employers can do better in supporting candidates. We think that it would be very nice if they provided feedback, and they're doing this more and more. We know that more and more candidates are receiving feedback now, but also there is an issue with data consent and privacy, and there are some EU framework, legal framework that are coming on board, which are going to make this interview regulated. So it's going to be a bit of a gap they need to think about. And also create a support system for candidates, and really help candidates understand this is not about them, and this is might be an embedded process in the technology. Well, thank you very much for listening to us. I think I've spoken for 38 minutes, so I'm on time. And it would be great, to hear question, feedback, provocation, comments, and so on and so forth.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Zahira and Dimitra, for that really interesting presentation. It's really nice to sort of see this topic approach from a sort of user perspective, and to sort of try and understand how people who are actually subjected, if you like, to these this form of interviews, how they sort of feel about them, and also to see sort of some practical recommendations coming out of it. So that's really amazing. So can I invite people to who have questions? So if you have questions, if you could either raise your hand electronically. I think most of us are used to Zoom by now. And I see Federico has already put his hand up. Or if you like, you can put your questions in the chat, and I will try and keep an eye on both. So I'll go straight to Federico. Please, could you ask your question?
First of all, great job. I really enjoy your presentation. I think you're doing a fantastic job. Just curious to know two things. Firstly, why you're not using theories of socio-materiality? You're still using theories about socio-technical systems, which seems to be a little bit behind where DIS field is moving. And secondly, whether you have come across any trade-offs between, for example, fairness, equality in the workplace, and the rule and rationale of the machine, of the technology, machine learning, which is all about efficiency, effectiveness, cutting costs. Did you come across any trade-offs and any tensions? And that kind of leads to theories of paradox. So these are really my two observations here. Thank you.
I can start with a question about socio-technical versus socio-material. So when we started this project, we wanted to look into the experience of job candidates as they encounter these technologies. So the focus was very much placed on experience as such. And then having one of our research assistants, Rachel Starr, a phenomenologist, we tried looking more into kind of ideas around phenomenology and philosophy of technology. And it was just difficult not to focus in a way on, what is the nature of technology and what is the agency of technology that takes us away from kind of socio-material considerations as we look more into kind of the essence of technology, really, rather than the work that socio-material theories do. Although it is a valid point, and I think if we do aim to publish this paper in an information systems journal, I think we will need to kind of focus a bit more on, why sociomateriality is not perhaps a suitable framework. Obviously, it's not a kind of anything physical here that job candidates deal with, but it's a valid point for sure for them.
Yeah, also just to complete that question, Dimitra and I are a strange team because I'm more of an individual focused researcher and she's more of a sociologist. And we are really, your question, I think, fits straight into this mesh that we are trying to create, right? We're really going down to a micro sociology, social psychology perspective rather than a really complete social perspective. Regarding the trade-offs and paradox, I'm sure we could find some. We have not focused on that, but it's a great point. And you are absolutely right. There is no way that this technology are going to stop because they have to be used. I mean, the sheer amount of candidates that companies are receiving and the way things are going, these things are here to stay. So the paradox is in itself embedded in the fact that we need to use them, but they have downsides. So yeah, absolutely, great point.
Okay, brilliant. And I forgot to mention, actually, if people want to turn their cameras on, that would be really good to kind of help with the discussion, particularly if you want to ask a question. But we've got Andy's got his hand up, so I'll invite Andy to ask his question. And then after the answer, I see that Heina has got a question in the chat. So I'll go to you after the answer.
Thanks, Will. I've got a similar question to Federico's, and I came in a bit late, so I might have misunderstood at the start. But on that first slide when you were talking about theoretical framing, I saw an Olikowski reference. So I kind of thought you were talking about sociomateriality. But then you started talking about actor network theory and the agency of the technology, which I thought was quite an interesting way of looking at it. But of course, if we're going to talk about the agency, or if you're going to talk about the agency of the technology, then that's not going to work at all with sociomateriality, because sociomateriality is all about the conjoined agency, and you can't back to Giddens and structuration, and you can't separate the agency of people from the social structure, which is technology. And I quite liked the ANT, but I thought that seemed to me to be a bit contradictory with having an Olikowski reference. But it seems like I might have missed a bit right at the start, so I might have misunderstood something. But yeah, agency of technology. How does that kind of fit in with the theoretical framing that you were talking about? If I was to reduce it to a question.
Okay, so the theoretical positioning is into the kind of broader social study of technology, looking into technological agency and what technology does as we interact with it. Obviously, Olikowski, I mean, the kind of sociomateriality literature has roots in the kind of socio-technical ideas, and that is how the two are related. The paper is not really looking into kind of sociomateriality, Olikowski's or Barat's work at all. But what we want to look into is, how the agency of technology mediates the experience of job candidates as they go through this process of automated interviews. So our origins of this was really into kind of IS scholars that take a kind of phenomenological approach to technology. And that is how the agency comes from, the focus on the agency, but it's not about, strictly speaking, about socio-materiality as Olikowski, Barat and others have talked about it. But I can see that, depending on what kind of journal we select, I think these questions need to be responded and addressed up front. That's a good point.
Okay, thanks, Dimitra, and thanks, Andy, for your question. So there's a question in the chat from Hina. If you would you like to turn your video on and ask the question?
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you.
My name is Hina. I'm a PhD student, and I'm kind of like doing research on the articles that is done by Andy. I have taken it as kind of my backbone of my research, and I'm doing the exploring the ethical issues of using artificial intelligence specifically by HR professionals. And I'm working with one of Andy's students, Dr. Ara Zirar. So my question is from you guys, that what would you like to comment on this topic, that I want to have an idea about what are the ethical issues of using artificial intelligence in HR, as you guys have kind of explored it in kind of like from the perspectives of the those job seekers. So what is your point of view about using artificial intelligence and those ethical issues? Thank you.
Well, it's a very, very big question. So there are more and more papers that are coming up. I can tell you, there is, from our perspective, in our research, so I'm not speaking about ethics in general in HR, which you're asking about, which is a very, very wide topic. But from our perspective, we encountered a series of ethics tensions about ethics when we found how platforms, which are effectively commercial agents who are focused in capitalizing, making money out of these technologies, sell themselves versus what we know deliver. So they deliver much less. So for me, coming from finance, so my first job was in finance for a very long time. And, it's almost like when you are overselling the returns of a financial products, when you actually, you are marketing a product by, speaking, putting some aspects, emphasizing some positive aspects without really thinking about the negative ones. So it's effectively a similar thing that is happening here, right? We are having the platform overselling. I wouldn't want to use the word mis-selling because it's a bit serious, but the results of their they can deliver to. So that's I think the main ethical issue that we encountered here, is what the user is told and the employer is told versus what actually is delivered behind the scenes. There is also another ethics issue on data usage. Consent is really in the small prints here. It's not clear to any of these users what data has been harvested from them. They do not know whether they are, remember also, this is a very interesting situation because these guys, the job seekers, they have not signed an employment contract. When you sign an employment contract, you are effectively undergoing the framework of that company. But here you are outside the company, so but you're still giving your data to platforms or companies. So there are a lot of really interesting ethical tensions that emerge from this research.
I think one more
Thank you very much.
In addition to what Zahira has said, and obviously in addition to the issues of bias and transparency that we do not look into this study, is one about the potential of these technologies to kind of really represent the personalities, or to really provide an assessment of these job candidates in as full as possible way. And I think what our interviews indicate is that job candidates are fully aware that the type of questions they get and the type of responses they think they have to provide construct a picture that is completely different from who they think they are. So this kind of partial production of knowledge and assessment of them, I think raises a lot of ethical kind of questions and concerns, something that wouldn't necessarily happen if the interview was done face-to-face, where you have this opportunity to get immediate feedback from the other person, and there is opportunity for argument and counter-argument. It's not the same in this particular context, where questions are very fixed and the answers are in a way very much prescribed somehow by what people think that the bot would like to get as information. So I think there is an ethical question around the knowledge that is being produced.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. So actually, I had a question. One of the things I was interested in when hearing, the findings, I was wondering what participants, after they've been through this and this whole process and they're reflecting, how did they actually feel about the organization that they're applying to, and how did they feel about the job? Did they still want to take the job, or were they just completely, did they feel completely sort of objectified and kind of dehumanized to an extent that they're like, I'm not sure I really want to work for this company anymore?
You want me to go through this, Dimitra? Yeah. So, so we asked some, so there is, I think there is much more, and there is some emergent study on that exactly, on how usage of technology is changing the relationship between the employer and the employees, right? So in this case, sometimes I ask that question, but of course, as an interviewer, I ask that question without really expecting an answer. But my instinct would have been that exactly they felt objectified, but because they are actually glorifying this technology, they're seeing as a latest thing to have. It's such a cool thing. Some people really loved to, well, it's so funny because when you ask them at the beginning, what do you think about this technology? How is this changing your opinion of the employer? They would say, no, it's not. This is great. This employer has got the latest technological innovation. And then as you went through the interview, is usually a minute 35 or 40 of the interview, which happens all the time, is in qualitative research. Once you had this person reflecting, they were coming out with all the negatives, right? So the paradox that Fede was asking about was really embedded on the fact that they really liked the technology, but they were really trying to comply with it and changing themselves to comply with it. We saw this a lot. So it's asking that question, how has this changed the opinion of your opinion of the employer, is not necessarily the right question to ask, in the sense that they would say, oh, this employer is super cool, it's got the latest technology. So it's really interesting question. I can see Andy's got his hand up.
Interesting. Thanks for that. So Andy, I think his hand up. I think that's probably the last question.
Yeah, just quickly then, thanks, Will. Just a follow up for that, really. I mean, that's made me think about, did you kind of explore the counterfactuals? How do they rate they were positive about the technology? And I think back to 20 years ago when I was doing milk round interviews, and I used to have to put a suit on, get on a train, go to a different city, and it was all, sometimes they're on campus, but you still have to put a suit on. It's all quite stressful. And I can see why you'd be like the idea of a robot interview that you can do at your own time when you're ready. But then they have this reaction once they start doing. I just, how does it? But basically, milk round interviews are horrible. So how does it compare to the normal milk round interview?
No, that's exactly what you're saying. So, and I am also interviewing people for another research project about hybrid work, right? And it's the same kind of thing. So, I think we are caught more widely in this world of hybridness, technology and personal, into this thing where we all love working from home, but we're all missing meeting people, and we are all loving, having our, gym pants on and our tie on the other side on, and, having to half dress. So there is a lot of things. So absolutely, Andy, you're catching a really good point here, that they loved it and found it difficult at the same time. But for us, the most interesting aspect was their internal state and how this was affecting their image of themselves as future workers at that point in time. Some of these people passed these interviews and they were very happy. And the difficult thing was for those that didn't, going back to where we started with this conversation, the people that have accents, the people who had Middle Eastern mannerisms, the people who had a speech impediment, the people who had dark skin were the ones that actually told us straight away, this has not been nice. You know, I don't know if I am making myself come through this process. So, you know, that was a really interesting aspect.
I think also what is interesting is how they basically created the environment of the interview as if it was a kind of a face-to-face interview, in the sense that even materially, to go back to your questions about sociomateriality, they set up an environment that would look as if it was a kind of conventional face-to-face interview, both in terms of, you know, how they were preparing themselves, you know, the clothes they would put on, you know, the preparations that would
make changing the room. Some people were taking things down of their walls, so not to make it more. Yeah.
Yes. So there is an element of materiality, to go back to Andy's and Fede's question,
which we have captured, by the way. Yeah.
Could I interrupt briefly and abuse my position of being the co-director of the centre? And we don't actually have to end bang on the hour. So for those who have to leave, please feel free to go. I know there's some students here in the audience, and I just wanted to ask, you don't have to answer. If you want to be silent, it's fine. But what do you think of what you've heard from your own experiences of having done these kinds of interviews, if any of you are still here?
And especially, do you want to write a diary?
I just want to include other people.
Yeah, I would like to speak on it. Yeah, I just recently finished my MSc in management. I did my semi-structured interviews as well. I have experience of doing the interviews, and the talk which I have today is very kind of like, I got a lot of knowledge how to been through all these interviews and what should be your approach while kind of doing those interviews. It is very helpful. And I would say that, as I told you, I'm also doing my PhD. So this session really helps me how I should work. The way this work is being presented today, I know what steps I'm going to start from and how eventually I'll be completing my process of from like starting my PhD and coming to an end. So it was really helpful session for me. And I would like thank you all. Thanks to you all for this.
Thanks.
I meant, are there any students left in the audience who have actually had to do these things? And do you find what Zahira and Dimitra are saying applies? Or that's all. That was just really to enable other people to speak who are not academics necessarily. You don't have to say anything if not. Good luck. I'll hand over to Will then.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Jackie. Yeah, so thanks, just to say thanks so much for a really interesting presentation. It's been really interesting to hear about it and to also sort of hear people's thoughts. I saw there were a lot of very positive comments in the chat. So, you know, obviously a lot of people thought the same, really. Just quickly, if people could quickly complete the feedback form that you see on your screens, that'd be really helpful for us. And also just quickly before I close down the meeting, just to say, just a reminder for next week's Digit Debates talk, which will be Sana Ojumpera, who's going to talk about skills for the planetary labour market, Indian workers from the platform economy. So yes, thanks a lot to everyone.